Hey everyone, this is Tony Stemen, research consultant with the Novo Group, and this week instead of a sourcing tips video, we're actually doing a recruiting tips video, and I am joined by actually two executive recruiters from the Novo Group who will be introducing themselves in just a moment. And what we're going to be doing is a two-part series where we talk about scoping calls. And in this first video, we're going to be defining what a scoping call is. And then we're going to also talk a little bit about how to prepare for it. And then in next week's video, part 2, we'll be talking about how a scoping call should look when you're actually on the call. So I'm going to start by letting the executive recruiters who have joined me today introduce themselves. So if you just want to both just quickly introduce yourself, tell us how long you've been recruiting and what your industry specialties have been.
Sure. This is Sabrina, Rana, and Jen. I've been recruiting for about a decade, and for the vast majority of that time, I focused on information technology, also spending a number of years also focused in on executive-level search.
Okay, thanks, Sabrina.
Hi, Tony. Sabrina, this is Frank Milianti. I'm also nearing that decade with recruitment focus and really spanned a number of industry focuses within financial services, a bit of time in the energy space as well, and have focused on a lot of our consulting level work within the firm here at Novo.
All right, well, we are happy to have Frank and Sabrina joining us today for this interview and also to talk a little bit about a scoping call. So let's go ahead and dive right in. And Sabrina, I'm going to start with you. If you just want to define for us what a scoping call is.
Absolutely. I really feel that a scoping call is an opportunity to better understand a client's business as well as a specific area that we will be working within when deciding on the scope of a position. It's also the moment to align our recruitment strategy and effort to the hiring needs of that particular business as well as its overall direction in the future to our highest capabilities out of the gate. It's also the third portion of that, an opportunity to establish the groundwork for credibility, which is further established through solid delivery. That way they understand that you understand their business and know what they're seeking from a recruitment perspective.
All right, well, fantastic. So thank you for kind of defining what that initial contact with the client is when taking on a position. And Frank, is there anything you want to add to that definition?
I think Sabrina did a really good job there of focusing on what that meeting really addresses. And I think to reiterate a little bit, it really allows, both the recruitment partner and client to discuss certainly not only the role at hand broadly, but to really dig into the key skill sets or pressure points, challenges of the needs of that client. And I think the goal is really to arm the recruiter with the knowledge of that hiring manager and to be a recruitment partner and fully understand what those must-haves and softer skill sets really make an A-plus hire for our clients. And moreover, again, an opportunity to learn more about the business itself, as Sabrina had mentioned, and how their potential hire fits into that business and set that strategy and expectations from that point forward.
All right, well, fantastic. Thank you both to Frank and Sabrina for sharing your perspective of what a scoping call is. And I think that has a great application when we're looking to become recruitment partners with a client and how to make a good initial impression and also to make sure we have a great understanding of the positions that we're working for the client. And so now that we've kind of defined a scoping call and what that looks like, we're going to really move into how to prepare for that scoping call. And I'm going to ask you each kind of a set of questions just to give your advice and opinion on how a recruiter can best prepare for that scoping call. So Frank, we're going to start with you. And I'm going to ask just kind of a basic question here, but when preparing for a scoping call, how do you know what questions to ask and kind of how do you decipher what the pertinent information is to kind of get across to the client in that scoping call?
Sure. Good question, Tony. And I think when you look at which questions to ask, and I know we'll get into really what types of questions we may be asking and what we're addressing as we move forward. But I think what can be tricky in what you asked me, how do you read the client? Most often scoping calls may be over the phone and not in person. You're not physically seeing somebody's body language or necessarily, able to tell what their reaction is to your questions. I think it's really important to mirror your client's tone and response as best as possible. Not every client is going to want to share their whole story, organization, department. And I think it's important that as a recruiter, you do your due diligence prior to any meeting to be sure back-end items like that. Whether it be the size or scope of the department, the organization, and thinking about what questions to ask. It's really, I think, about setting the tone on that first call, and I think being as consultative as you can, and being able to read the client and understand their pain points and what's important to them, and then really from there digging into questions, all while, of course, getting what you need to be sure you can hit the ground running. So, reading through that black and white and looking at some of the gray, I think it's important to understand having that relationship start off on a good foot before really digging into some specific questions.
All right, thanks, Frank. And I think you answered that very well, and kind of how to prepare for what questions to ask and really decipher the appropriate information to gain in a scoping call. And so, Sabrina, I'll now ask you, what are some of those baseline activities that you should consider doing to ensure that you're prepared for a scoping call as a recruiter?
Absolutely. Frank actually alluded to a lot of these points. It's so important to conduct that preliminary research by many facets. Not only do you have to be aware of the client's business and where they are positioned in the marketplace, but you do have to understand the skill set that you're speaking of and to, be that in terminology or understanding the market landscape, any hiring challenges other firms have had within that area. It's really important to do this preliminary research. Also, it definitely makes sense to go about recruiting for the position, creating some sort of baseline sourcing just to see what exists in the marketplace. That could be very telling and will arm you with important details to share and impart on that scoping call. Reviewing the provided position description against where the role is today within the group, any other individuals that may have that position, that too is important. Another thing that I always like to do and think is a good practice is to understand where you would go to find that type of talent, be it in competing firms. If competing firms don't have a role such as that, maybe you can find an individual that has a matching skill set within a different type of firm. These are all details that any hiring manager would find important.
Okay, and I'm going to stick with you, Sabrina, for a minute here. So kind of rolling on to another level of that, if a recruiter wanted to create a baseline template for the scoping call to make sure that those activities were covered, what would be the important information they would want to include in that scoping template?
Definitely. Well, from a very high level, there are three major areas to cover in the body of a scoping. The first is the general logistical items pertaining to the search, be that compensation or location information, for example. You also circle back around to these items at the end to reconfirm. A lot of times in discussion, it makes a hiring manager or the parties involved, the stakeholders, think twice about some of these logistical items, even prior to really diving in. And the second thing is really understanding the business and what the role and the position, what role that position plays within that infrastructure, right? So understanding where the position sits in the overall business, how they interact with the business, the team environment, as well as the overall goals of the business. The third area is the deep dive into the actual skill set and requirements that determine if a candidate is qualified. This is the day-to-day activities, the type of communication structure that a firm may have, some of the duties and background, the tools that this individual will be working with, and then also the very hard factual items that a hiring manager just cannot do without in order for a candidate to find success in the position, be it 3 to 5 really key items that someone must have in order to find success.
Okay, and that's a great high-level overview, and I think that's going to be really helpful for some recruiters out there listening who haven't really developed a full-fledged scoping template. I think sometimes understanding those high-level items can really help you to craft something that works for you and the clients that you're working for. So thank you for sharing that. And Frank, I'll close out with one more question for you. You talked a little bit about making sure that you're prepared to speak to the client. And sometimes it can be a challenge. Sometimes maybe you're introduced for the first time on a scoping call to a hiring manager. And so how do you really set a strategy and positive expectations prior to the scoping call to make sure that that's a successful first impression?
Sure. Good question, Tony. I think most recruiters, when they think about setting strategy and expectations, are certainly doing so after they've completed, the scoping call as a whole, right? They've got the questions that they need answered. They're ready to go to market and set those expectations. But I think the reality is you need to really be talking about strategy and setting expectations the whole time, right? Right from the get-go. And, this scoping call is likely the client's first interaction with you as a recruiter. And you easily could put yourself on the other side, right? You're about to spend recruitment dollars on a firm. You'd certainly want to know when you might see candidates, how to go about finding those candidates, just general timelines, previous recruitment experience in this space, and be able to talk a little bit about what you've done in this space. So the selling and information sharing really is something that I don't think should ever stop and really should be set up from the get-go of any conversation. And I think, of course, when it comes time to discuss next steps and what they can receive from us as a recruitment firm, it's, of course, important to be sure you've addressed any and all questions about the role. But once you've been able to tackle that, you can, of course, then put specific expectations around timelines and what they can expect for you as you go to market. But being able to talk about strategy from the get-go, how we envision partnering with the client to make sure that they get a successful win is an important aspect of recruitment as a whole. And I think it's something that should be certainly done from the very first point of contact.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Frank. And I want to thank both Frank and Sabrina on the call today for making sure that they're sharing some of their knowledge from their years of experience in the recruiting industry. It's much appreciated. Once again, this has been Tony Stemen, research consultant with the Novo Group, tackling our first recruiting tips video as we talk about how to prepare for a scoping call in part 1 of this 2-part series. Please make sure you join us next week and like and share this video on all of your social networks as well. And make sure you follow Novo with the links in the description below to make sure you stay up to date with all the latest recruiting and industry news. This has been Tony once again signing off.